By nightfall on March 6, the 27th Marines had captured Hill 362 Charlie. The position had cost the 5th Marine Division 693 casualties over 4 days of fighting. But with the March 6 artillery preparation, the final assault had succeeded in a single afternoon. The lesson was clear to every Marine commander on the island. More shells meant fewer coffins. The artillery preparation on March 6 wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a systematic approach to reducing Japanese resistance through overwhelming firepower. Every morning at 0700 hours, the Corps artillery fired a standing barrage against known Japanese positions. Every evening at 1800 hours, another barrage saturated suspected infiltration routes. Between these scheduled fires, individual batteries responded to dozens of call-for-fire missions from forward observers embedded with infantry units. The system was devastatingly efficient. When a Marine infantry company encountered a Japanese pillbox, the company commander would radio his battalion headquarters. The battalion would relay the request to the regimental fire support coordinator. The coordinator would contact the FDC. The FDC would assign a battery, calculate firing data, and transmit fire commands. From the initial radio call to the first shell impacting the target, the average time was 4 minutes and 30 seconds. This responsiveness was unprecedented in military history. During World War I, artillery fire missions had taken hours to coordinate. Individual batteries had to calculate their own firing data, adjust for wind and temperature, and fire independently. The result was scattered, ineffective bombardments that gave the enemy time to take cover. The American system centralized everything. One FDC controlled all the guns in a sector. One brain, hundreds of barrels. The battlefield became a grid of mathematical certainty. Any point within 14,000 meters of a Marine artillery position could be targeted and destroyed in less than 5 minutes. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Kuribayashi's artillery consisted of approximately 300 guns of various types. Some were naval guns removed from ships and emplaced in concrete bunkers. Some were field artillery pieces brought from Japan. Some were mountain guns designed for pack transport. None of them were coordinated through a centralized fire direction system. Each gun crew calculated its own firing data. Each gun fired independently. The result was sporadic, uncoordinated fire that rarely achieved concentration of effect. Worse, Japanese ammunition supplies were critically limited. Kuribayashi had ordered strict fire discipline. No gun was to fire unless it had a high-probability target. No crew was to waste ammunition on harassing fire. Conserve shells for the final battle, when the Americans would mass for their final assault. But that final assault never came. The Americans didn't mass. They ground forward, meter by meter, supported by artillery fire so dense that Japanese positions couldn't survive long enough to inflict significant casualties. By March 10, 5 days after the massive bombardment of Hill 362 Charlie, Kuribayashi's artillery had been reduced to fewer than 70 operational guns. The rest had been destroyed by counter-battery fire, buried by shell fire, or abandoned due to lack of ammunition. The Americans, by contrast, had 273 operational guns and more than 4,000 tons of ammunition still stockpiled on the beach. The disparity was so extreme it bordered on absurd. The Americans were firing more shells per day than the Japanese had fired in the entire 3-week battle. But the true innovation of American artillery on Iwo Jima wasn't the volume. It was the precision. The Marines had deployed forward observers with every company-level unit. These observers, usually junior lieutenants or experienced sergeants, carried radio sets that could communicate directly with battalion fire support coordinators. When a forward observer spotted a target, he would report its location using a standardized grid system. The island had been divided into squares, each square 1,000 meters by 1,000 meters. Each square was further divided into smaller squares, 100 meters by 100 meters. A forward observer would report, enemy pillbox, grid 473-829. That single transmission provided enough information for the FDC to plot the target on a map, calculate range and azimuth to every battery within range, and initiate a fire mission. The entire process took less than 3 minutes from target identification to rounds impacting. The Japanese, watching from their bunkers, couldn't comprehend the coordination. They would spot a single Marine with a radio. Minutes later, the entire hillside would erupt in explosions. How were the Americans coordinating fire so quickly? The answer was technology and doctrine. The Americans had developed the forward observer system in North Africa in 1942. They had refined it in Sicily and Italy in 1943. They had perfected it in Normandy in 1944. By the time they landed on Iwo Jima, every Marine officer down to platoon level understood how to call for and adjust artillery fire. The standard call for fire consisted of 6 elements. Observer identification, Fox 3, meaning forward observer with Fox Company, 3rd Platoon. Warning order, fire mission. Target location, grid 473829. Target description, pillbox, troops in open. Method of engagement, high explosive, impact fuse. Method of fire and control, battery, 2 rounds, adjust. That transmission, radioed in clear voice, took approximately 15 seconds. The FDC would acknowledge, calculate firing data, and transmit fire commands to the selected battery. The battery would load, aim, and fire. Total time from initial call to first rounds impacting, 270 seconds on average. After the first rounds hit, the forward observer would assess. If the rounds were on target, he would transmit, fire for effect, battery 3 volleys. If the rounds were off target, he would adjust. Right 50, add 100, meaning shift the point of impact 50 meters right and 100 meters further from the battery. The FDC would recalculate, and the battery would fire again. This adjust fire assess cycle would repeat until the target was destroyed. The entire process, from initial call to target destruction, averaged 12 minutes. The Japanese couldn't respond to this pace of destruction. Their communication systems were primitive by comparison. Most Japanese units relied on runners to carry messages between positions. When an American artillery barrage destroyed a communication trench, entire sectors of the Japanese defense would be isolated, unable to call for support or report enemy movements. Kurabayashi had anticipated communication problems. He had ordered the construction of redundant telephone lines, with cables buried as deep as possible. But American artillery fire was so intense that cables were constantly being cut. Repair crews couldn't reach the breaks without being killed. By mid-March, most Japanese units were operating in isolation, making local decisions without coordination from higher headquarters. The Americans, by contrast, had multiple redundant communication systems. Every Marine rifle company had at least 2 radio sets. Every battalion had 4. Every regiment had 6. If a radio was destroyed, there were backups. If radio communication failed, there were field telephones with buried cables. If cables were cut, there were messengers with jeeps. The Americans had engineered redundancy into every level of their system. The Japanese had engineered determination into their soldiers. Determination was admirable. Redundancy was decisive. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The difference in artillery philosophy extended beyond equipment and doctrine to fundamental questions of supply. The American logistical system was a marvel of industrial organization. Every shell fired on Iwo Jima had been manufactured in the United States, transported 5,000 miles across the Pacific, unloaded at a rear area base, sorted by type and lot number, loaded onto amphibious vehicles, transported to Iwo Jima, unloaded onto the beach, sorted again, transported to forward ammunition dumps, and finally delivered to gun positions. The entire process, from factory to firing battery, involved hundreds of ships, thousands of vehicles, and tens of thousands of personnel. And it worked flawlessly. On March 6th, the day of the massive artillery preparation, Marine logistics units delivered 630 tons of ammunition to the beach. That same day, artillery batteries expended 528 tons. The Americans were building their stockpile even while firing at unprecedented rates. The Japanese logistics system had collapsed by February 25th. No supplies could reach Iwo Jima from Japan. American submarines controlled the waters around the island. American aircraft controlled the skies. Kuribayashi's garrison was fighting with the ammunition they had landed with, and nothing more. Every shell fired was one shell closer to total depletion. By March 15th, Japanese artillery had been effectively silenced. Fewer than 30 guns remained operational, and most of those had fewer than 10 rounds of ammunition. The mighty coastal defense guns that Kuribayashi had emplaced in concrete bunkers, capable of firing shells weighing 200 kilograms, sat silent. Not because they were destroyed, but because they had no ammunition. The contrast was stark. American artillery fired an average of 18,000 rounds per day during the last 10 days of the battle. Japanese artillery fired fewer than 200 rounds per day. The ratio was 90-1. This wasn't a battle. It was arithmetic. But the human cost of that arithmetic was profound. For the Marines, the artillery support meant fewer casualties during assaults. The official Marine Corps history of Iwo Jima credited the Corps artillery with saving an estimated 3,000 Marine lives during the 36-day battle. The calculation was simple. Without artillery support, infantry casualties during assaults averaged 30%. With artillery support, casualties averaged 15%. Over the course of the battle, that 15% difference translated to 3,000 men who went home instead of being buried in the black volcanic sand. For the Japanese, the artillery meant slow strangulation. Kuribayashi's defensive strategy had assumed his men could hold out for several months, inflicting such horrific casualties on the Americans that they would negotiate a peace settlement. The plan required that Japanese positions remain viable, that his soldiers could maneuver and counterattack, that morale could be sustained through hope of eventual reinforcement or victory. American artillery destroyed that hope. There would be no reinforcement. There would be no counterattack. There would only be bunkers collapsing under the weight of high explosive shells, soldiers dying in darkness, and the slow, grinding awareness that every sunrise brought them closer to extinction. Kuribayashi understood this by mid-March. His final radio message to Tokyo, transmitted on March 21st, was stark in its honesty. The situation is hopeless. All positions are being systematically destroyed by artillery fire. Ammunition is exhausted. Water is exhausted. We will fight to the last man with rifles and grenades, but the outcome is not in doubt. The Americans have unlimited shells. We have unlimited courage. Courage is not enough. That message was received in Tokyo at 0340 hours on March 22nd. The Imperial Army General Staff debated whether to release it to the press. They decided against it. The message was too defeatist, too honest about the material disparity between Japan and America. But Kuribayashi's soldiers didn't need official confirmation. They could count. They could hear the thunder of American guns firing thousands of rounds per day. They could see the absence of Japanese artillery firing back. They could do the math, and the math said they were going to die. On March 26th, 35 days after the invasion began, the American command declared Iwo Jima secured. Organized Japanese resistance had ended. Kuribayashi was believed to have died during a final banzai attack in the early morning hours of March 26th. His body was never found. Of his garrison of 21,000 men, only 1,083 were captured alive. The rest died in their bunkers, in their tunnels, in desperate charges against overwhelming firepower. The Marines lost 6,821 killed in action. 19,177 were wounded. Total American casualties, 25,998. Nearly one-third of the entire landing force. It was the costliest battle in Marine Corps history. But the arithmetic of artillery told another story. The Marines fired approximately 800,000 rounds of all types during the 36-day battle. That was 22,222 rounds per day. 47 shells for every Japanese soldier killed. 31 shells for every American casualty prevented. In the cold language of military logistics, this was an acceptable exchange rate. Shells could be manufactured in Cleveland and Detroit. Marines couldn't. The Battle of Iwo Jima demonstrated what American planners had known since 1943. Wars between industrial nations would be decided not by the courage of individual soldiers, but by the capacity of factories to produce weapons and the logistic systems to deliver them to the battlefield. The Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima was among the best trained, most motivated infantry in the world. He fought from prepared positions with excellent fields of fire. He had 8 months to fortify the island. He had competent leadership in Kuribayashi, one of the few Japanese generals who understood American military capabilities. None of it mattered. He was fighting an opponent who could fire 15,000 shells in an hour, who could sustain that rate of fire day after day, who could replace losses and resupply ammunition faster than he could inflict casualties. The lesson of Iwo Jima wasn't about tactics or courage. It was about industrial capacity. America produced 96,318 aircraft in 1944. Japan produced 28,180. America produced 38,000 tanks in 1944. Japan produced 3,500. America produced 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during World War II. Japan produced approximately 8 billion. The numbers scaled at every level of production. More steel, more oil, more electricity, more machine tools, more trained workers, more of everything that turned raw materials into weapons. Kuribayashi understood this. He had visited American factories in 1928. He had seen the assembly lines at Ford. He had watched steel being poured at Pittsburgh. He had written to his superiors warning them that war with America would be industrial suicide. They ignored him. They believed in the superiority of Japanese spirit, in Bushido, in the warrior's code that transcended material considerations. Iwo Jima was where that belief collided with reality. On one side, 21,000 soldiers willing to die to the last man. On the other side, 288 howitzers and enough shells to fire continuously for 36 days. The outcome was never in doubt. The only question was how many would die proving it. When the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent on March 26, Iwo Jima was a wasteland. The island had been photographed from the air in June 1944, before the fighting began. Then it was photographed again in April 1945, after the battle ended. Analysts compared the images. The topography had changed. Hills had been lowered by 3 to 5 meters. Valleys had been filled with debris. The shoreline had been altered by tons of steel and concrete dumped during the fighting. 800,000 artillery shells had physically reshaped the island. This was the ultimate expression of American military power in World War II. Not the ability to win battles through tactical brilliance. Not the capacity to inspire soldiers to impossible feats of courage. But the simple, brutal capacity to deliver more explosives to a target than the enemy could absorb. To turn warfare into a production problem and solve that problem with factories in Detroit. The Marines who survived Iwo Jima would carry 2 memories for the rest of their lives. The first was the sound. The unending thunder of artillery fire, so constant it became background noise, punctuated by the sharper cracks of small arms and the concussive whump of mortars. Men would wake decades later, in peaceful suburbs, startled by thunderstorms that sounded too much like howitzers. The second memory was the knowledge of what had saved them. Not their training, though they were superbly trained. Not their courage, though they displayed courage beyond measure. What saved them was the fact that somewhere in Ohio, workers were stamping out shell casings on assembly lines. That somewhere in Pennsylvania, factories were pouring steel. That somewhere in the vastness of the American industrial complex, the machinery of war production was operating at a scale the Japanese couldn't match and couldn't counter. This created a peculiar guilt among some survivors. They had lived because America could afford to fire 47 shells for every enemy killed. Their friends had died in the days before the artillery system reached full effectiveness, when coordination was still being refined, when ammunition stocks were still being built up on the beach. The difference between survival and death had often come down to whether you assaulted a position on March 5th or March 6th. Whether your attack came before or after the artillery preparation. The Japanese survivors, those 1,083 who emerged from their caves after the island was declared secured, carried different memories. They remembered the helplessness, the sound of American shells screaming down, hour after hour, day after day, with no Japanese guns firing back. The isolation when communication lines were cut. the darkness when generators ran out of fuel, the thirst when water supplies were destroyed, the certainty, growing day by day, that they had been sent to die not in glorious battle but in slow attrition, buried alive in their fortifications. Some Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima kept diaries. These were discovered after the battle, translated by American intelligence officers. One entry, dated March 18th, was particularly stark. The Americans fire more shells in 1 hour than our entire division fired in 1 month on China. We cannot move. We cannot counterattack. We can only wait in darkness for the next barrage. This is not war. This is execution by mathematics. That soldier was correct. By mid-March 1945, Iwo Jima had become an execution by mathematics. The Marines had systematized violence to an unprecedented degree. They had turned the chaos of combat into a problem of fire support coordination, ammunition logistics, and target acquisition. They had built a machine for killing that operated with the efficiency of a factory assembly line. The broader implications were obvious to military analysts on both sides. If America could deliver this level of firepower to a small volcanic island 5,000 miles from the mainland, what could they deliver to the Japanese home islands? The answer was being demonstrated in the skies over Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, where B-29 bombers were incinerating entire cities. The same industrial capacity that produced 800,000 artillery shells for Iwo Jima was producing incendiary bombs by the millions. Japan's military leadership understood they had lost the production war, but they believed they could still win the casualty war. The plan was called Ketsugo, the decisive battle for the homeland. If America invaded Japan, the Imperial Army would inflict casualties so horrific that the American public would demand negotiations rather than pay the price of conquest. Iwo Jima was supposed to be a preview of that strategy. The Americans would suffer such grievous losses taking one small island that they would reconsider invading Japan itself. But Iwo Jima proved the opposite. Yes, American casualties were horrific, 26,000 in 36 days. But American artillery had demonstrated that firepower could substitute for bodies. The Marines had learned the lesson that more shells meant fewer coffins. If they applied that lesson to an invasion of Japan, if they brought not 288 howitzers but 2,000, if they fired not 800,000 shells but 8 million, then Japanese casualties would scale proportionally while American casualties might actually decrease. This was the cold logic that would lead to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. American planners were already calculating the artillery requirements for an invasion of Kyushu. Early estimates called for more than 5,000 artillery pieces and ammunition stocks sufficient for 90 days of sustained operations. The production orders had been placed. The factories were already ramping up. The shells were being manufactured, boxed, and prepared for shipment across the Pacific. Then, in August, 2 bombs eliminated the need for that invasion. But the lesson of Iwo Jima remained. Modern war between industrial powers would be decided not on the battlefield but in the factories. Not by the courage of soldiers but by the output of assembly lines. Not by tactics and strategy but by production capacity and logistics. This was America's way of war, refined and perfected in the crucible of World War II. It was devastatingly effective. It was also deeply impersonal. Soldiers became units to be sustained with supplies. Enemies became targets to be serviced with ordnance. Battles became problems of resource allocation. The mathematics worked, but it stripped warfare of everything except arithmetic. Years later, a Marine lieutenant who had served as a forward observer on Iwo Jima was asked what he remembered most about the battle. He thought for a long moment before answering, "The efficiency. We had turned killing into a science. I could call fire on a target and watch it disintegrate. It was so easy. Too easy. Sometimes I think about the men in those bunkers, waiting in the dark, listening to our shells coming closer. They knew they were going to die. They knew there was nothing they could do about it. That bothers me more now than it did then." That was the true legacy of Iwo Jima. Not the iconic photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. Not the stories of individual heroism, though there were thousands. The legacy was the demonstration that industrial warfare had reached a level of efficiency that made individual courage almost irrelevant. The side with more factories would win. The mathematics were irrefutable. And in March 1945, America had the factories, the logistics, and the will to fire 800,000 shells at one small island until nothing remained alive above ground. More shells meant fewer coffins. That was the lesson. It was a lesson paid for with 26,000 American casualties and 21,000 Japanese dead. It was a lesson that would shape American military doctrine for the next 80 years. And it was a lesson that began with the simple observation that artillery fire on March 6 had succeeded when infantry assaults on March 5 had failed. The guns had spoken. The mathematics had been done. And the answer was written in the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, in shell casings piled higher than a man could reach, in the silence of Japanese artillery that had run out of ammunition to fire back. The age of industrial warfare had reached its apex. Iwo Jima was its monument. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.